Hi, everybody. This brief recording is going to walk you through the cognitive psychotherapies. And we've got two principal ones that we're going to want to demonstrate some familiarity with. They have a lot of parallels, so that's actually why I'm including them in the same slide, because there's some things that are true for one and also true for the other. We do want to be able to distinguish between them, though, because they share some kind of qualitative differences. They feel differently, and people who are practicing one might use slightly different techniques than the other. So we're going to start on the left here with Beck's cognitive therapy. The gentleman we're looking at up here in the picture with the bow tie, that's Aaron Beck. He's a giant in the field of psychotherapy for establishing the process that now is either known as Beck's cognitive therapy or sometimes it's referred to as CBT because it's frequently combined with behavioral techniques in a form of therapy that is referred to as cognitive behavioral therapy. So the goal of this psychotherapy is going to be very similar to our other cognitive approach as well. And if you remember that cognition means thinking, this is going to seem logical. The idea behind this psychotherapy is that the thing that's causing people trouble in depressive disorders and anxiety conditions, or even just phase of life kind of interpersonal struggles, is that they may have adopted some maladaptive or unhelpful beliefs and thinking patterns that are preventing them from experiencing their optimal well-being. So the idea of this psychotherapy is to help the person identify these maladaptive beliefs and then explore and test alternatives to them that they could use maybe to replace them. So beliefs that might be more helpful. And I'm just going to click over to a document that you will have received a copy of in class from me. It's a list of typical maladaptive or unhelpful thinking styles. So if you're working with patients who are especially like depressed or anxious or kind of stuck with an interpersonal issue, they often will exhibit some extremes in their thinking that might not be helpful. So psychotherapists are trained to recognize these things and also help clients come to be aware of them so they can replace them with better stuff. Like this all or nothing thinking is sometimes referred to as dichotomous thinking, where people think either this thing is true or the exact opposite is true and nothing else in between exists. So believing that I'm not perfect if I have failed ever. So either I'm perfect and I get everything right on a particular test, I get 100%, or if I get some wrong, or if I get a B, then I have failed at life. That's all or nothing thinking. Obviously, there are not only A's and failures. There's a whole bunch of grades in between those things. B's and C's are by definition in between A's and F's, but sometimes people lose sight of that. Sometimes people will jump to conclusions in their maladaptive thinking. Like, for example, they might assume that they know why something other person has chosen an action when they really don't. Like if someone has texted a friend and that friend has not texted them back and has been several hours, they might start to think, well, it's because this person really doesn't care about me, and clearly my significant other who received this message, maybe they're planning on breaking up with me. That'd be kind of like fortune telling. So of course neither of those things is actually the only reason a person might fail to text you back in a timely manner. Perhaps the person is occupied, maybe they're in class, maybe they're at work and can't use their phone. Like all of those are potentially much more calming ways to rationalize and understand that situation. So you certainly don't have to go through or know all of them, but I wanted to make sure you had an idea of what we really mean by maladaptive thinking patterns. So these things tend to appear more so in folks who have anxiety and depressive conditions, and correcting them might help the person find relief from their suffering. So how would we go about doing this? Well, if you're using Beck's cognitive approach, you would, as a therapist, act as if you're kind of a fellow scientist with the client, that you're both trying to test out and understand and explore whether or not the way the person sees the world is accurate. So if the person is giving you an example of a belief that, well, if I fail this test, then I'm a failure at life, you might, sit with that thought and help them understand that, okay, well, maybe that is true, but maybe it's not. And if it's not, what would be the evidence of that? And if it's true, what would be the evidence of that? So you might have them see if, okay, maybe have them calculate the percentage of, how many people do they think among their classmates all get A's? And they might offer some percentage, like maybe they think that, between 10 and 20% of people in the school get A's. And then to ask them to follow that up to its logical conclusion. Like if people don't get A's and then they're failures, and only about maybe 10 and 20, whatever they'd come up with, percentage of people they think get A's. Does that by default mean that the 80% of the people in the school are failures? Like that seems extreme. So if that's not true, like if it's not true that getting anything less than an A means you're a failure, what might be a more helpful way of thinking about it? So you might generate some possibilities and have them try those out. For example, it might be more helpful to think that, okay, maybe getting something other than an A reflects the fact that you've got a little bit more to study before you've reached your goals. That might be a less scary way of thinking about a non-A grade, and maybe the person decides to adopt that way of thinking about it. And maybe they don't. The whole idea is that the client does get to serve a co-equal role in figuring out what kinds of thoughts are going to be helpful and what are not in Beck's cognitive therapy. Cognitive psychotherapists, and especially people practicing CBT, also regularly make use of something called stress inoculation. So if someone is worrying in anticipation of an upcoming event, you might ask them to think through the worst possible version of that. So if they're okay, if they're worried about an upcoming exam, for example, you might have them think through, well, what would happen if you weren't able to study at all? Like you had some medical emergency the night before the test and you couldn't do all that studying. And so when you go to the test, you actually don't know anything. And it turns out the teacher hands you a bunch of problems that are actually impossible to solve. And the test is in Spanish instead of English as you anticipated it would be. And you walk out knowing that you did not get a single item right. What then? Of course, most of us would recognize, although that would obviously be awful. Even in that worst case scenario, you still have a pulse. You don't live in a box. You still have friends and family that care about you. So if you can think through that even your worst, most catastrophic version of the future probably doesn't involve you dying, then you're ready for anything. Almost invariably, what actually happens is going to be nowhere near as bad as that. So if you can kind of think through and be prepared, and maybe even have some coping strategies in place, like some specific and concrete plans for if the bad thing that you're imagining comes to fruition, that might help the person encounter a stressor that they're woefully anticipating. Another strategy that cognitive therapists frequently make use of is asking the person to behave and think as if the thing that they want to be true was. So if they're depressed, ask them to think about and kind of very purposefully envision what it would be like to be non-depressed. Like you'd probably get out of bed earlier in the day. You might keep that appointment that you had made with a friend. You might sit up straight and smile more. So then ask the person, even if it feels artificial, to adopt those behaviors for some mutually agreed upon time. Maybe it's just 15 minutes the first time to sit up straight and smile. And then maybe if they feel comfortable with that, moving forward a little bit further. And okay, this week, every week, regardless of whether you feel like it or not, you're going to get up at 8 a.m. And keep the appointments that you had made. Those kinds of things might actually help the person see that maybe part of the behaviors that they were engaging in that were so problematic are actually matters of choice, that they could choose to behave in a different way and in a way that reflects more health. There are plenty of theories of emotion that we've talked about already this year that suggest if you just behave that way or adopt that set of behaviors, you're more likely to feel that way. So if you start behaving in a way that reflects greater happiness, you actually feel greater happiness. It's not a bad thing to try. As I mentioned, these kinds of approaches are often combined with some of our other more behaviorally oriented techniques, so you're likely to see them appear together. If we're trying to weigh the effectiveness of this, there is a lot of research support for the effectiveness of Beck's cognitive therapy, or CBT, in treatment with depression. It's also got widely proven efficacy with a lot of our anxiety disorders. It's been helpful in even treating conditions like insomnia, for example. So lots and lots of research behind the CBT. One noted problem, though, is if the person already recognizes their thinking is irrational, which does happen in some, in OCD, for example, In phobias, people often readily recognize, like, well, I know my fear of the spider is irrational. It's a maladaptive thought. I got that. But they still quite don't know what to do about it. You may need to go beyond these techniques, just pointing out or helping them understand that they're maladaptive. They're already there. So they might need some of our behavioral approaches in addition to the thought-based stuff, if that's the issue. Now, by contrast, rational emotive behavior therapy is the work of a gentleman named Albert Ellis, who's pictured here on the right. I don't know, this is an odd picture of him. Like, he didn't always wear those impossibly high-waisted pants. So, I definitely have other photographs of him. I'm not sure I'm using that one. But Albert Ellis also believed that what's behind a lot of people's dysfunction in anxiety and depression and other types of conditions as well is their irrational beliefs. He was a fan of, and I'm going to click on a link to show you this, you've got a handout of it as well. He was a fan of the idea that there are some core irrationalities that underlie a lot of people's struggles. So, for example, okay, this one, number 4. It's awful and catastrophic when things are not the way one would very much like them to be. He thought that a lot of people kind of failed to recognize that, okay, things can turn out not the way that you want them, and you'll still continue to exist. And like, okay, we do experience unfairnesses, and that's not necessarily, I mean, that's a part of living. Just the fact that you've encountered an unfairness that may feel very uncomfortable, but it's not insurmountable. It is a part of living. Okay, the anxiety disorders, this irrational assumption. If something is or may be dangerous or fearsome, one should be terribly concerned about it and keep dwelling about the possibility of its occurring. That should strike you as somewhat irrational. Like, just because something could happen doesn't mean you need to devote all of your time to it. He saw these things quite frequently with his anxious patients. So he thought that the way you should go about dealing with this when you find these thinking patterns in patients is that instead of just like trying to help them explore, test out, and then replace those ideas, just flat out tell them that they're wrong. And that means his style is much more confrontational. In transcripts of Ellis's psychotherapy with clients, he often, if a client was saying something like, but I must get A's, but this person should love me, he would say, whoa, 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 stop right there. Where did you get that should or must? Who says that you must get A's? That's not a rule for living. Who says that another person has to like you and that your well-being is dependent upon that? He was a fan of use of the phrase. He didn't always flat out accuse people of being stupid, although he came close to that. He might say to a client, you know, Brenda, you're a very smart woman, but that thing that you just said seems not so smart. Like, why would you embrace that kind of illogical thinking about the world? And so, as you might imagine, some patients respond really well to that direct confrontational style and some don't. So the core distinction between, okay, otherwise, like, this is very similar. I mean, people do use REBT to treat depressive and anxiety disorders. It's very similar to cognitive psychotherapy in that it also embraces this idea that irrational thinking is underlying the problem and you should change that irrational thinking. The core distinction is that this one changes the thinking, Beck's CBT in cognitive therapy changes the thinking by, treating the person like, doing some hypothesis testing, treating these thoughts like they could be true and maybe they're worth hanging on to, but maybe they're not, and let's explore some alternatives to them. And if you see someone like Ellis, he's just going to straight up tell you that you're wrong. It's much more aggressively confrontational as a psychotherapy. And that may be good or bad, depending on the personality features of the client who's experiencing it and the style of the therapist themselves. Like, some therapists feel very comfortable in that kind of confrontational style, and some don't. So that concludes our discussion